Hi, welcome to our AADL staff discussion of Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore by Elizabeth Rush. This book is the October 2021 Science Friday Book Club pick, and AADL is participating in the book club as a partner. You can find out more information on this book club at sciencefriday.com. They're having events all October. And you can also find this book in our collection at AADL in physical copies, and we also have extra copies available on Overdrive electronically. So before we jump into our discussion, maybe we should all just go around and briefly introduce ourselves, since there are lots of us here, which is great. So since I have no idea which order any of you are actually appearing in each other's screens, I will just let people popcorn their introductions and hope it doesn't take a million years.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Marissa. I'm in the outreach department.
I'll go next. I'm Elizabeth and I work in the archives department.
I'm Christopher and I work in the youth department.
I'm Lucy and I also work in the youth department.
I'm Katie and I work in the outreach department.
I'm Beth and I work in the outreach department too.
I'm Lauren and I work as a desk clerk at the library.
I'm Emily. I work in the events department. And Jacob, I think we maybe didn't get your introduction. I think maybe you were muted.
My name is Jacob and I am an employee at Ann Arbor District Library where I work in the outreach department.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to discuss this book. So this book was originally published in 2018, is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And I just want to go really quickly through all of the places that Rush covers. You know, the topic of the book is sea level rise. So she talks to people in these very specifically hyperlocal places, and there's kind of a reason for that. But in the Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana, Small Point, Maine, Phillipsburg, Maine, South Florida, Miami Beach, Florida, Staten Island, New York, Pensacola, Florida, and then Alviso, California, and just the larger San Francisco Bay Area. And she's, you know, interviewing a lot of people who are looking at the problem of sea level rise in the United States and how it is affecting wildlife and human populations. And so my first question for you all is that, you know, she kind of has this moment that she talks about at the very beginning of the book where she's in Bangladesh on a non-climate change related journalism assignment. And she's talking to a farmer who is, I think, hundreds of miles inland from the sea, and yet his crops are dying because of salt water. And that's when she first becomes aware of the problem of sea level rise. And so that's kind of her epiphany moment that makes her then want to start researching and writing this book, which I think took her about 5 years to complete. And she asks people that she encounters, especially people who are on the front lines, whose properties are being flooded out and who've been dealing with the problem of sea level rise, was there a single moment when they became aware of it? And the answers to that question are kind of mixed. Some people can say yes, and some people can say no. And so I guess my question to you is, was this book your kind of wake up moment or introduction to sea level rise? And if not, sort of has it added to or changed your perspective on the issue?
Well, I would say that, like, I was aware of sea level rise just coming from the East Coast. You know, I have family who's in Boston, and there are parts of Boston that are floating. They were built that way. But what I learned from this book, I didn't know about, like, the salt and the salination in plants and the destruction of plants really through their roots, through sucking up the salt. And that was interesting to learn that, because that's such a big piece of how the land is being destroyed.
I also learned that by heating up the planet, we're also expanding the volume of the oceans. That was a new and depressing fact that I got out of this book. You know, I think she makes the case very well of this kind of closed loop, that everything is reinforcing this one pathway of climate change.
I'd say it wasn't so much an introduction, more of a case study of just what's currently already happening. Just since we live in Michigan, I don't have family on the coast. So it's one of those things that I think in the news, we always hear about like sea level will rise, but we don't always hear about like the impacts that are currently already happening.
Yes, like I can sit here and say that I knew that sea levels were rising. I cannot say that I really understood what that meant and how that affects people's lives, how that affects wildlife. And I had no idea how it's going to continue to do so. I do have to admit there was a level of ignorance that I had coming into this book, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have read it because I've learned so much.
Yeah, I think for me too, it was kind of like an abstract thing that I was aware of is currently happening, but maybe not to the extent that it is consistently happening, and not even just here. Like you mentioned in the beginning, she's in Bangladesh, which she doesn't really cover much of other places outside of America. It's focused on America, but yeah, it's just like a problem that's affecting people's lives quite destructively at the moment. And also when I was reading it, I'm like, I wonder what has happened since this book was published. Well, I know what's happened somewhat, but like I know I don't know everything that's happened, and I'm just, yeah, this topic is a lot going forward and going back, I guess.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's like this is actually, we had a talk at the library a couple of years ago, and the city brought in actually a sociologist who is working on actually like population displacement models, which was really interesting. And that was probably one of the first things that really opened my eyes to sea level rise and like its hyper local effects on human populations. Like it's really like kind of like a handful of counties around the US that are going to be affected you know, in the next, you know, few decades. But like, it's just like, you know, Hurricane Ida, like I just, since reading this book, like just watching the coverage of that storm, like this book just completely changed the way that I really think about events like that now. And I know there's like, okay, I have an understanding, even though I've never lived in a place like that, you know, I have a better understanding of what actually happens.
Yeah,
So-
I was going to say, sorry.
No, go.
Just the backstories of folks and the
Oh, I got out.
impact, like can you hear me? Yeah. And one moment. Internet's unstable. Sorry. Anyway, just the number of stories, and then when Hurricane Ida was taking place, like you said, as I was reading it, it was just like, oh, it's so much more devastating. It's just, yeah, such a really sad story of how we're treating the earth. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, the topic was definitely a new one to me. Like most of you, it's something that I've heard of but haven't experienced. So I think that for me, the book was very powerful, but the first person accounts of what was happening in people's lives was really sort of brought it home for me and has been sitting with me ever since I read it. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you, Katie, for your amazing segue into my next question. because one of the things that I think is the most interesting about this book and the way that's written, most of it is written in the first person from Elizabeth Rush's perspective. She's a journalist. She makes the choice to do that, but she also includes 6 interludes that are pretty short. Most of them are just a few pages long, that are first person accounts of people who have been either through catastrophic flooding events or who have been dealing with sea level rise directly. And she talks about later in the book at the end, where she really emphasizes storytelling. And she says that, at first I thought I was giving people a voice, but then I realized that they already have voices and that I was just handing them a microphone. And, and I think that it's always fraught when a journalist is trying to balance, how to tell people stories, and not, impose or overlay too much, and be true to the people, especially when there's a power imbalance, as is so often the case with the people she's interviewing, who are people of color, who are people living in low income communities that are, really affected by climate change much more than others. So I wanted to ask you, what was your impression of these interludes in other people's voices, and if you had any thoughts on the strengths or the possible downsides of the way that Rush has chosen to tell these stories.
Well, sort of piggybacking on what I was saying earlier, I just think for me, while this is a very interesting and powerful subject, a lot of times it's science journalism writing, which can be difficult, dry. And so having the personal narratives in there, which I love to hear how the rest of you feel about it, but I thought that they seemed very well written in the person's voice. And she kind of describes how she did that. Can't remember exactly, but it seemed like an interesting process. But anyway, it helped me process the science information that was coming at me better by reading that, and then being able to read, okay, here is like this person telling me I'm going through this, and this is what's happening to me personally. It helped me digest the information. So I really appreciated it.
I thought
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I feel like it kind of hits harder when you hear it from a personal perspective. Like I think it's Oakwood Beach, is that what it's called, in New York, where she was in the house and left and her father ended up drowning. It's one thing to hear that story from a third person perspective, but then to hear it in her own words and to hear what it was like to be in the house moments before that happened. Just like everything she did made an impact on the outcome that she experienced. And it's just so powerful to see that from her perspective rather than from the journalist's perspective. So I thought it was a good addition.
Yeah, I thought those passages were so compelling, and I think her whole approach to hearing people's stories is delivers the message so much better. At one point, she's comparing how she's relating to people and how Samuel is relating to people. And she says she wants to roll her eyes at what cliched, stupid things he's saying. And I think that really speaks to how she really cares about the people that she's talking to. And other people are looking at this problem from such a removed situation.
Yeah, I think putting those passages in there helps also to makes the problem seem more immediate. Like, I think you can hear sea level rise, you can hear climate change, and those sound like a bigger concept, but when you get that really personal story, for me, I was just like, wow, this is happening now, and this is happening to these people. And I agree, Christopher, I think it seemed like she even formed like lasting sort of friendships with some of the people that she came in contact with. And so I think she included their pieces with a good deal of sensitivity.
For me, hearing the individual stories as well as the science, and then trying in my mind to multiply the number of people to get to 200 million as it was, it's a little overwhelming when you think about it from that perspective. Looking at the individual stories, which are really compelling and very emotional, and then just the staggering amount of people who are going to be impacted is pretty scary. Although I have to say, the book, I was expecting it to be very scary. Unfortunately, nothing that she said in the book really surprised me in terms of the seriousness of the problem. Some parts of it actually made me feel a little hopeful, to know that there is an effort, at least to the extent possible at this point, there is some effort to try to mitigate on a temporary basis what some of the impact will be. But I just, it's a kind of a fleeting optimism, right? I also liked this parts of the book where she went into different areas of the country and talked about the migration of animals due to climate change. And I'm sorry, I'll shut up now, Beth.
No, that's fine. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I didn't feel hopeful, but yes, I agree that I was intrigued by the wildlife that she, was sharing about, and the impact on that. And but I didn't feel hopeful because I just feel like we keep repeating the same thing. I mean, yeah, there are chunks of area that are being preserved and protected, but there's a lot of times that they just, that, I don't know, it goes by the wayside, or somebody else is in charge and look what happens, So it's a real disservice to the world. I think I've already said that, but I mean, it's just really, I did not feel hopeful at all. But I'm glad it was in there for you.
Well, I mean, from this perspective, I guess when you think about how politicized it's become, that's the part that's not hopeful. As long as it's a politicized issue rather than here is a problem that we need to fix, that's the part that's depressing.
Yeah, I would agree that she talks in the end about, communities having to relocate, and that they would have to decide together as a community to all relocate. So that's people on all ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And I read that and I thought, like, when in the recent past has that happened, where the haves have willingly given something up to help the have-nots? And so that part, which is so true, it would take a communal effort. I'm skeptical about our ability to act as a community, sadly.
I think, speaking to that, there was an example she gave towards the end of the book about Facebook and how they contributed $15,000 to the effort to preserve the surrounding area, and then simultaneously bought another plot of land, elevated the building high enough to prevent future damage from the floods they know are coming. It's just, yeah, that doesn't give me much hope at all.
Yeah, I do want to jump in here, though, and say that one part that did give me some hope, since we're talking about communities deciding to relocate, was the Oakwood Beach community in Staten Island, who through a FEMA grant, this hazard mitigation buyout program, all of them decided to leave. And I thought it was very interesting. I mean, I liked hearing these kind of in-depth pieces of reportage of particular communities on the shoreline, kind of staring down the barrel of climate change. It was very important to them to know that this land wouldn't be bought out, developed into condos, right? Like they wanted to make sure that this land, if they would then be converted to wildlife refuge of some kind. That it wouldn't be like this instance of being what little they had, and then rich people coming in and developing on the same land.
Oh, did we lose Lauren? Okay, well, what he's saying about the Oakwood community leaving basically on the condition that this land would not be redeveloped, that definitely leads to another question that I have about this concept of resiliency and the way that, as Rush is explaining it, there's the National Flood Insurance Program, which I still don't entirely understand because it seems like a very complicated thing. But basically what happens is that it ends up encouraging people who have a home, they're paying a mortgage on flood prone land, that they will be given funds, which we know are just, she doesn't go so much into this book, but go so much into it in this book, but those funds are really inequitably distributed. But the funds encourage people to rebuild on the same land. And so it's just kind of like this cycle. And she quotes someone in the book, and I had a hard time finding it, what page it was on, maybe you guys marked it, but it's Tracy Washington of the Louisiana Justice Institute. So she's speaking from an African-American New Orleans perspective. Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient. And it seems like there's a lot of pressure on certain communities. It's just like, oh, well, why don't you just stay? Why can't you just rebuild? Why can't you just be resilient? And I wanted to get your sense of what's happening, of what are the forces going into this this narrative that we can just keep rebuilding and it'll be okay.
All I can think of is that it's just financial. That it doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive, but just let's just forget about what just happened and we'll do it again, and we'll build again. The idea that they have to rebuild on the same place, some folks had to do it multiple times. It's just it doesn't make any sense. And the fact that everyone would have to move together and I may be conflating a couple of concepts, but that was, some of that was going on where one or two people in a setting couldn't just decide to go vacate. Everyone had to. But yeah, what is driving it? I think it's a lot of this money, politics, short-sightedness.
I think it's also a way to keep the undesirables out, right? You keep the lower class and people of color out of areas where white people want to live. I think that's one element to this. And I think she does such a good job of getting into why people settled there in the first place. And I thought that was really eye-opening.
Yeah, along with what you were saying too, Beth, about people having to move as a group, I thought it was really interesting in Oakwood, where people had more means to do it. They were able to choose where they relocated. But then in in Louisiana, that particular place is a group of in Ile de Jean Charles is a group of Indigenous people, and they're being asked to move together to a new location that's chosen for them. And that struck me because I think someone in there says like they've been moved before. I mean, this is the difference between how those groups of people were treated was very striking. And I think there's a real attachment to the land for the people in Louisiana, with good reason. And I'm not sure that that was taken into consideration when it's like, we're going to decide a new location for you. And I do think that is, both, as you're saying, Christopher, like racist and a socioeconomic issue.
You know, she kind of throws in this bit about Robert Moses, who was, I think, a mayor or somebody of New York, who put in all of these highways that broke up, you know, African-American, low-income communities, and then made those highway passes deliberately so low that city buses could not pass under them. So that, right, that certain people could not leave. You only if you could afford a car could you drive to these more affluent parts of the city. And then she basically says that, you know, sea level rise kind of like acting in a similar way, or that if we don't act, that if we don't see the long history of racist housing policies that put certain communities in more vulnerable areas, then sea level rise is just by default going to be another Robert Moses.
I think the biggest contributor to that is just the lack of resources, which you mentioned. The insurance specifies you have to build in place. So it's like, if you don't want to live in this place, we have no other place on earth, apparently, that you can live. So yeah, it's just like this very stark contrast of wanting to keep people in place, but also the place that they are being kept is no longer tenable to live. But it seems like the insurance companies are just like, we can keep going with it for pretty much forever until it's underwater. You have to keep rebuilding in place because there's nowhere else for you, apparently.
I think when you think about it from a global perspective, the same thing is going to be true for places that have poor minority, well, not minority for their area, but very poor people who have little means to move to a new home or even a way to do that. I think it's going to have a huge impact globally from an injustice kind of perspective as well. You know, if you live in an area where your whole country or your whole territory is going to be completely underwater, where do you go? You know, is there a place in the world where people are going to open their arms to you and welcome you? Or is everyone going to go, oh, don't come here? You know, it's that kind of thing as well. Which in a way is even, it's just very frightening to me that whole populations might end up being wiped out simply because everyone is too afraid to have this these migrations take place, which they have to, you know, whole areas that are going to be completely underwater. Those people have to go somewhere, their families, everything. It's kind of staggering from that perspective. It's definitely happening here in this country. And of course, it's always happened here in this country, even without climate change. I think there's a huge injustice across the country in the housing of every person. You know, we have minorities and people who are of color and poor means who are always sequestered somewhere because people don't want them to see them or have them be next door. It's less pervasive in some areas than others, but mostly it's just that's the way it's always been. And changing people's minds and hearts about that is difficult as well.
Well, and you know, Dee, you're speaking to something that I too was have been thinking about. I think sometime last year, you know, along the same lines of this book, I read or I listened to the podcast Floodlines by The Atlantic, which is a multi-episode series about Hurricane Katrina that I would very highly recommend. And I think one of the narratives that strongly came out of Katrina and, you know, and lots of other flooding events is that somehow the people who live there are to blame, that like you should have just known better than to live there. And yeah, it's like, I mean, first of all, as if people have climate change modeling data just like sitting around that they can know, you know, that 100-year storms are going to turn into 10-year storms. But also, yeah, why are people living in flood prone areas in the first place?
Right.
Like,
That had to be developed, and it was specifically, I mean, the Swamp Act of 1850 seems to be the root of a lot of these issues. And I know that like wetlands in this area are highly disrupted and they're like just hated throughout the entire country. So it's not surprising that that is a cause of a lot of it, but it is also kind of surprising that it has such an impact that these wetland areas can change all of these species up until it totally disrupts human life.
Well,
Also, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say it's true that developers, when they are looking for places to build, they're going to buy the cheapest land they can find. And if that land happens to be sitting on top of contaminated water or, you know, on a floodplain or whatever it happens to be, you know, if those become homes that are much more affordable than anywhere else, then that's where people who don't have a lot of money are going to be forced to purchase a home. So it's not like, I don't think it's really a matter of saying they should have known better, because whether they knew better or didn't, did they have a choice, really?
And what an interesting point Rush makes about how flood insurance is subsidized. So that's encouraging people to stay there and settle there. And I felt like she and I became so conflicted over whether flood insurance subsidies are a good thing or not. So I just thought that was such an interesting point that she keeps coming back to.
Plus, she also mentions that for some people, even with that subsidy, it becomes unaffordable,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And then what does a person do?
I was just thinking that this book is a good introduction and primer to kind of acclimate us to the idea of retreat. That like flood insurance and like seawalls, that it's this false sense of security that you feel safer than you are. That like, yeah, sure, this house is in a floodplain. It's all I can afford. There's insurance. It seems fine, and really, it's not. And I think the dominant narrative in like the news has been rebuild. It's fine. We'll mitigate. And I think this really lays out the whole concept that retreat is kind of where a lot of people will be at, and kind of getting us used to where are we going to put climate refugees. There's going to be a lot more than we had been thinking probably. And
I agree with you, Marissa, that as a solution had not ever been something that I heard talked about on the news. So it's always been rebuild, rebuild, like let's get this community going again. And so it never had even really occurred to me that it was something that you could do, was like move an entire community. So that was definitely something that was new for me.
Yeah, I never heard about that happening in New York on like Staten Island and Oakwood Beach. So that was really surprising to me. And then I also found it interesting that when she went out to San Francisco and was talking to the expert there, that he had no idea that that had been going on as a strategy, and like that would probably really help their efforts, moving the human presence away from what they're trying to rebuild with the wetlands. But obviously that's going to be messed up by the whole Facebook thing.
Well, yeah, it's like what got me was that not only were the people out in the Bay Area surprised that other communities are relocating, but they were like, but our real estate's too expensive. There's not going to be, which, I think they're just being realistic about it. There's just not going to be the political will to do it, which I think is a fair point. But it's just like so beyond like what they can even conceive.
I think Lauren kind of touched on that too, like with the Oakwood Beach thing. The residents were not willing to move if that land was going to be developed. But if the land's going back to nature, then that's a possibility. But like they don't want someone else benefiting financially off of their giving up this prime real estate in their mind, which it's not really prime real estate, but culturally it is still. The coast is still culturally valuable, but it's probably not a good investment long term.
I think there's also the idea in this book, like what that I thought was interesting about retreat, is that if it's going to happen on a larger scale, you have to look at housing, but then you have to look at infrastructure. And, what does it mean really to just keep moving back? And it's more than just people relocating, but it is changing a lot of things. And you have there's one guy who mentions like what would we move if we were, what do we value? We would relocate the Smithsonian, we would create a seed bank, we would, it's all the pieces that are essential to society. And that seems like a huge undertaking when people are just in their own housing are hesitant to retreat. So but I thought that was interesting.
And I think wrapped up in all this, in this particular part of this conversation is a certain notion about what is home, and can you really take home with you? And it makes me think of the book starts with a quote from a Native American man. He's talking about how, back in the day we used to, caribou was a big part of our culture, and now the caribou no longer live here. But we still have that part of us. It's still a part of our culture, even though the caribou aren't there. And I think, especially as represented in that part in Louisiana, some people's identities are their homes, while some people are more apt to, or are more able to retreat because they understand that, or maybe, whether this is true or not, they're able to understand that home is something that you can take with you. Not to be all Oprah, but like home is where the heart is,
When you think about it from the Native American perspective, though, prior to all of the new settlers coming to this new world, Native Americans tended to migrate based on the seasons. So they literally did carry their homes with them. In the winter, they might be in one part of the country, and in the summer in a different part. Depending on what was going on, but yes, I definitely think that the concept of home is an incredibly important piece of it. Not everyone is willing to think about home as a matter of wherever your family happens to be, and things like that. So I think that climate change is going to force people to rethink what home is, probably for most people, maybe not the super wealthy, but.
So I want to pivot because there's one topic that I want to discuss, and this is just really just more of a selfish thing, because this was definitely like the one part of the book that I was like, oh, I need to talk to somebody about this. So this is going back to the concept of risk, and there's the chapter that is called Risk. And, you know, she kind of tells the story out of chronological order. But basically what happens, she has this experience where she is interviewing a man in Pensacola, Florida. So he's poor, he's older, he's African-American, and she notes that she feels threatened by him. And then she kind of just like checks that feeling and is like, that's, you know, that's conditioning talking. Like, that's not my instincts talking, that's my prejudice at work. And meanwhile, she's working alongside Samuel, who somebody mentioned earlier. You know, who is this professional who's working in this field of risk assessment and who ends up sexually harassing her. And that she completely has it backwards, and that what seemed like a risk at first was completely safe, and what seemed completely safe at first ended up being the risky thing. And and she kind of extrapolates that point to thinking about climate change and sea level rise. And I just wanted to get your sense, your takeaway, what you thought about that chapter and that aspect of what risk assessment really is, as we're looking at sea level rise, but also as we're looking at each other as groups of human beings.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was really intrigued by that chapter too, and just her revelation, and the fact that she shared that she had been harassed, which I feel like that must happen in so many circumstances with nonfiction writers and folks, you know, doing research that's not shared. So I thought I really liked how she was able to share how she felt about the fact that she misinterpreted and you know, felt fear in the one person, and then the other, you know.
Oh, did we lose Beth?
I think so.
Well, if someone else wants to jump in, and then maybe we can catch up with her later.
Well, I thought that it was interesting in that piece about risk, when she's talking about risk assessment, that I think it's sometimes what we're told to fear. You know, she said like the messages that she'd gotten from TV, from, you know, movies, and like what's really a threat to people, and the real risk, you know, we don't consider things that are risky in a bigger picture. And she says that what she'd been taught to fear has never been something that, I think she says, has never come home to roost. Like, the real things that are a threat to her are not the things that she was told would be risky. I mean, in this particular case, it's a white man, but I think it's interesting to put that in context of climate change as well, because how many of us are aware of the true risk? Like, how much is that portrayed to us?
I was really glad that she included this. When I first started reading this chapter, it was kind of jarring, just because it seems at first glance like so different from the other material of talking about climate change. But really, when you're talking about risk, like she's talking about the flood insurance program and how really that is based on a very calculable risk of it requires certain homes to fail at certain times, and you know those times, and you know where and how it's being blown apart by everything failing everywhere. And just the ability to calculate risk. Even for me, as like, I used to be a community organizer, and thinking about like going into homes, like who knew where I was, where was I going, like kind of these like silent calculations that you're constantly running against, like how am I presenting, like physically, like what am I wearing, like there's a lot of like risks that you're trying to mitigate by maybe wearing a higher collar, like whatever. Like it's interesting to put it in that framework of mitigating risk and calculating risk, because it is like an ever-present danger.
Well, it makes me think too of like, right, so we have climate change and, and what that, like, I think what it looks like for each person is different because people are living in different places and are being affected by different weather and just different things. But I just think about like, at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was like, I don't know if it was a meme or if it was just something going around on the internet. People said like doomsday preppers are really mad because they thought that the apocalypse was going to look one way and it didn't, right? Like they were ready to be in their shelter with their canned food. And now that the apocalypse is here, they really don't know what to do with themselves. And yeah, I think that like when we're given this like really limited images of like what certain risks look like, and it's like, but do we actually know like what the real risk is, and are we open to that information if we've been conditioned otherwise?
There are just so many different ways to look at what risk is, and how it impacts us, and how it changes our decisions, how it impacts our ability to make decisions that are quote unquote the best for us. So we let our perception of what we think are risks guide us in our daily life. And I think, it's often quite surprising to see what the real risks are as opposed to what we imagine those risks to be. There are so many different things that factor into climate change risks and what the outcomes might be. And I think that, well, I think that it's very good that she put the information in, because I don't think that that type of information is often shared in that way. When people are doing research for things and they're out in the field, it's not something that's typically published. So I think in this particular instance, it was a good thing to include in the book, even though at the time I was like, wait, where is this coming from? It wasn't what I was expecting to see included in the book. But I did think it was important. If that kind of information doesn't get shared, there's like a negative impact from it not being known. Do you know what I mean? I think it's that part of it is a really important piece, that anyone who picks up that particular book now can see, oh, okay, so this is running through her mind, and here's what's really going on.
Also, yeah, it's also important to share. I'm thinking as you're saying this, that because other people will get this story from her. And I think she even talks about another woman who experienced it. And she's like, I just wanted to let her know that it was nothing, experienced sexual harassment. She's like, it's nothing that you were doing. It's nothing, it was no fault of yours. And like you're saying, Dee, if these stories are never included, nobody has a chance to be aware of it. And if you are another journalist who's been in this same situation, it might make you realize, like, well, hey, I wasn't doing anything wrong. There was no risk, it was no fault of mine. So I think whether or not it seemed to fit in the story at the time, now that I'm reflecting on it, I think that it is really important that you put it in there just as something, as a way to reach out to other people.
Yeah, or even if you go back to the risk parallel, when she's talking to her friend who's also been assaulted or harassed in the field, she says, like, I wish I would have known so I could have been prepared. And they're kind of talking about it. She said, yeah, this happens all the time. So being aware of the risk and or what you think is the risk and what's the actual risk is important to know.
Okay, so we're about at the end of the hour here. So I want to wrap this discussion up, but thank you guys so much for digging into the book with me. But I have one more question before we go, which is the always fun question. Especially now that you have read this book, what are you planning on reading next, if anything? Or is this changing, like sort of what's on your reading list?
I just started a book called Bewilderment by Richard Powers. I think he wrote Overstory. It's a new book, and it's actually about a astrobiologist, and he has a son who's neurodiverse, and that's a piece of it. But then there's also this: they're studying the climate and the world around them, and it's interesting to read that right after this, because they're talking about endangered animals and birds disappearing. In fact, they were talking about an ivory-billed woodpecker. I think in the book they were talking about it being endangered. In the book I just started, but it just came out on that list that was released of 23 species that are now extinct. And so, like, reading Rising and hearing about birds and insects and wildlife, and then reading this new fiction book that's also addressing it, and then seeing this real life news piece come out like, hey, these 23 species no longer exist. That just kind of has gotten me thinking more about like where you see all those pieces and just connecting them. But it just was interesting to see things play out in fiction, in real life, in a book like this.
I think it's interesting that you said that, because I was thinking about Overstory the whole time I read this book, actually, for some reason. She mentions the tree wars in the Pacific Northwest, which is basically what Overstory is about. So just a weird tangent that I'm going off on. But as far as what I want to read next, I was hoping to read Nature's Best Hope. I can't think of that. This is more about like transforming your own yard to help mitigate climate change and habitat loss for insects and birds. So hopefully I can do some local stuff to do my little part.
I've just started looking at lists of books on climate change. I really want to read what other countries are starting to do, because I'm interested in finding out how, especially the countries that are going to be really hit hard, to find out what their plans at this point are, just for my own information.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here and say that, toward the end of the book, Rising, that is, Elizabeth Rush mentions that she's feeling just like kind of hopeless at the myopic thinking of humankind in general. And also maybe, since this book really concerns Americans' addictions to, what are those addictions? I just sort of by happenstance found a book of poems that, just the cover caught my eye. I actually have it right here. It's called Habitat Threshold, written by a poet named Craig Santos Perez, who is, I believe, he definitely lives in Hawaii. He might be a native Hawaiian, not sure, but it felt like this very, very slim volume was like a distillation of Americans and maybe humankind's cultural addictions, and it was a gut punch to read this book of poems shortly after Rising. But I'm glad I also read that, so I wanted to pass that along.
It sounds good.
Yeah. What's the name of that again, Lauren?
The title of this book is Habitat Threshold, and the poet's name is Craig Santos Perez. And that picture on the cover is actually his father holding his baby daughter as she's encountering the waves for the first time. And of course, superimposed above that picture is an inverted picture of glaciers, and below it is a picture of forest fire. So that does definitely give you an idea of what you're in for if you choose to read this book.
I don't know if I have a specific title. I kind of have been wanting to revisit The Life and Death of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan. I read it a few years ago. It came out in 2017, I think. And so I've kind of been looking for other things like kind of in that vein of hyper local stuff. Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know, something in that is what I'm looking for.
My book that's probably next is one that is called The Longing for Less, Living with Minimalism by Kyle Chayka. And I think it's just kind of like a history of minimalism, kind of going back to ancient times into the present, and talking about, why this, strain of human thought has persisted. And I think I've really been interested in the topic recently, but I've just been thinking that, like, reading something like Rising, I actually just like visualize all of my possessions just like flooded and waterlogged. And as unlikely as that is to happen to me here, right? And just thinking about, traveling light in more dimensions than one is probably a good adaptation to climate change.
Except for books.
That's why we have a library, and the books live in one place, and you don't have to have them in your home.
True.
Thank you again so much, everybody. And again, Rising by Elizabeth Rush is available at the Ann Arbor District Library as part of the SciFri Book Club in October. So enjoy.